In this guide we will talk about the basics of the types of damage that we can find in this game without diving deep into it. There are many different types of damage in this game, and most of the types come with a corresponding type of resistance. For instance, there is physical damage and physical resistance, fire damage and fire resistance, etc. So, let's begin. The types of damage are physical damage. The physical damage can be dealt by both players and enemies, and it exists almost everywhere in the game. Most types of enemies deal an amount of physical damage. This type of damage can exist on weapons, skills and scrolls, and the main attribute that increases this type is strength. So, if you increase your strength attribute, your physical damage output goes up. There are two corresponding types of resistance for physical: armor and physical resistance. Both stats mitigate only physical damage in different ways, and they can coexist on a build. Without going deep into the mechanics, the armor can be found mainly on armor items such as helmets, boots, bracers and chest armor, and sometimes on other types of items. Usually the more armor you can have, the better. Physical resistance can be found on all types of items, and it comes in the form of percentage. For instance, plus 10% physical resistance. It is not mandatory to try to increase both stats on your build. The usual way to do this is to focus on getting as much base armor as possible on a build that focuses on strength-based armor items, or to try to equip items with lots of plus % physical resistance on builds that focuses on intelligence-based items, because these items have much lower base armor than the strength-based ones. Just get as much as possible. There is also the stat Armor Absorption, which in simple words affects how effective your base armor will be at mitigating physical damage. Elemental damage. In many cases, you will see the stat called elemental damage. This means that if you get, for example, an item that provides 99 elemental damage, now this item deals this number divided by 3, because there are only 3 types of elemental damage in this game: fire, cold and lightning. So, in this case, the item will deal 33 fire, 33 cold and 33 lightning damage at each attack. The stat plus % elemental damages will increase equally all 3 types of elemental for both instant attacks and damage over time attacks. So, if you have 99 elemental damage which deals 33 of each type and get an item providing plus 100% elemental damages, now your attacks will deal 66 fire, 66 cold, 66 lightning. At the same time, this buff will increase by 100% the fire burn damage over 3 seconds you might have on your build. The same would happen to frostburn or electric burn over time. There are also stats that increase specific types of elemental damage, for example, plus 50% fire damage or plus 50% fire burn damage over time. In this case, the percent to instant fire damage will affect only the instant type, not the overtime, and the percent to fire burn will affect only the overtime, not the instant type. The main attribute to increase elemental damage is intelligence. There are also resistances to these types of damage. First, we have the stat plus % elemental resistances. When we get this stat, we get an equal amount of all 3 resistances to all 3 resistances. So, for example, plus 20% elemental resist would provide plus 20% to fire, 20% to cold, and 20% to lightning. Of course, there are also stats affecting specific resistances, such as plus % fire resistance, which would affect only this specific type. Elemental resistance buffs exist on many skills and items. There are plenty to choose from. Pierce damage. Many players get confused with this type and they think that armor mitigates pierce damage. This is false. Pierce damage has its own resistance, which is called pierce resistance, and it is totally irrelevant to armor. The main way to reduce pierce damage is to increase your pierce resistance. This type of damage is almost everywhere in the game. It's been used by enemies quite frequently and it can be very deadly. So, Increasing this resistance would be crucial for survivability. But it is also a very powerful type to use as a player. Actually, one of the highest DPS builds you can make in this game can be based on pierce damage and spears, and it can do critical damage in the millions. That is just an example. Pierce damage has dexterity as main attribute, but it is one of the worst types of damage when it comes to scaling with attributes. It also has a conversion mechanic which is called pierce ratio, and it can be found mostly on some types of weapons. A simple example: a spear has base damage 100, which is always physical damage unless stated otherwise. The spear also has 50% pierce ratio. This means that now 50% of the base damage becomes pierce damage, the rest is still physical damage. So, there are two main ways to get pierce damage. One way is from conversion that happens only on the weapons that have the stat on, or by stats that provide a flat amount of pierce damage and exist on items and skills. There is also the stat that increases the amount of the pierce ratio conversion, which is called plus increased pierce ratio. That stat increases the base amount on the weapon multiplicatively. So, for example, if your weapon has 20% ratio and this stat provides 20% ratio, then it will not become 40% on the weapon because it is not additive, it will become 24%. Enemies with bows especially can be very deadly if your pierce resistance is bad, since bows have a long range of attack, so keep an eye out for items that provide pierce resistance. Vitality damage. This type of damage is not very common amongst the enemy lines, but it can still be deadly if you don't have enough resistance. This damage scales with intelligence attribute, and it can be found mainly on skills of Dream and Spirit Masteries and on items. The thing to remember here is that some types of enemies are immune to vitality damage that you deal, such as undead enemies. Undead enemies exist in many places in this game, and this makes things harder for vitality damage users, which also makes the Spirit Mastery very powerful in this case, because with this mastery we can reduce the huge vitality resistances of undead enemies significantly, and now we can deal vitality damage to them and kill them. So, the immunity of undead is conditional. If you reduce their vitality resistance enough, then you can damage them with this type of damage. Poison damage. This type scales with dexterity attribute, and it is mainly a damage over time effect. Usually it is not easy to make builds that will kill enemies fast enough with this type of damage over time, and many types of enemies will be quite resistant to poison, so it will take some time for this effect to finish them off. But still it is doable if you got to specialize your builds around this damage, since there are very big buffs in the game to support this damage over time. If you want to see some examples, take a look at two builds of mine, the Defiler build and the Green Death build. Both have build guide videos on this channel. For poison damage we get the poison resistance, which we can find on many different items, some components and on some skills. The Herbal Remedy skill of Hunting Mastery is perfect, since it provides a huge number of poison resistance. Bleeding damage. One more type of damage over time is bleeding. This scales with dexterity attribute, and it has its corresponding resistance. For many players, both bleeding and vitality resistances can be hard to obtain. So, the Runes Mastery is a good option to remedy the problem with a skill that provides resistances to both types of damage. Bleeding is one of the better types of overtime damage because it gets good buffs from some skills and items, and you can actually make builds that specialize on this type and kill enemies by bleeding them to death. But the problem is that many types of enemies are immune to bleeding, such as undead constructs devices, or have high resistances to it. So, for better efficiency, a bleeding-based build should also have a second main type of damage to help with destroying those enemies. Other than the resistances to the types of damage that have overtime effects, we get the stat that decreases the duration of overtime effects on our characters. So, if the duration is reduced, we receive less damage. Although, If we have enough resistance to these types, things will be okay and we won't need the reduced duration, which after all exists on very few items out there and cannot be found easily. Life Leech over time damage. This is a stat which steals life from enemies and gives it back to the player. It is based on a flat amount that can be found on different items or skills, and it has its own life leech resistance. This resistance is not very easy to get, but you can get it from items. This stat scales with another stat that is the +% life leech and with player level. The good thing about this one is that when you apply it on many enemies very fast, it can keep you alive because it will start leeching life from all enemies instead of one enemy. If you use it on a single enemy while you are getting hit by many, it won't help very much, so you will need to have some strategy to use it effectively. The life leech resistance can be found on a few items only, but thankfully it is not very common and you will not need to worry about that very much. There are some enemies or bosses though that could destroy you based on this effect, so if you find items providing this resistance, maybe you should keep them in your stash. The damaged version of this effect though can be found on plenty of items and components, so you can use it effectively if you figure out how to do it. Again, there are enemies like undead that are immune to this type of damage, so there is that. A tip: when you reach Sparta with a level 5 or so character and you are about to fight the boss there, try to get a weapon that deals life leech over time or poison over time. This will help you against the boss to defeat it easily. Energy drain damage. This type of damage is not going to get you anywhere as a new player, so let's skip it. It deals an amount of damage based on how much energy you drain from the enemy. Details are a waste of time, so let's forget it. Bonus damage. This type is exactly what it says. A bonus number which you get on the items that provided. It doesn't really scale with anything and it is not important, but if you get it on a weapon that you can use, then there is no harm. It doesn't have a corresponding resistance. Damage Retaliation. This stat can be found on a few items and skills, and it is not something to write home about. It scales only with the level of your character, and in a very few cases it can be affected by a very few items that may provide a small buff to it. This effect is similar to damage reflection but not the same. Retaliation always comes with a flat number on items or skills, and it means that if an enemy attacks you with melee attacks, they will receive that flat amount of retaliation damage that you get from your items or skills. It is a nice type of damage to have only if you can survive easily in close combat, since it works only against enemies that attack you with melee attacks. It does nothing to spellcasters or ranged attackers. Damage Reflection. Reflection damage is one of the most powerful types in this game. When enemies attack you with all types of attacks, melee, spells, bows, thrown weapons, etc., they can receive their own damage back affected by the amount of reflection that you've got from items or skills. It is a nice stat to have as you level up, but it becomes extremely awesome if you build your hero around it. To do so means that you will need to farm for specific items that provide huge buffs to reflection, and that you will make the right choices for skills and masteries. This damage type doesn't have a resistance, and when enemies use it, you can actually kill yourself very easily if you are strong enough. To reduce the amount of damage you receive back, there are two main ways. The first is to have great resistances on the types of damage that you do, and the second is to have the stat which reduces damage from specific races of enemies. For example, if an undead enemy uses reflection and you equip an item that provides less damage from undead, now the reflection will not be as strong as it would be without the less damage from the race. Thanks for watching, reading or listening to this guide. If you enjoyed and find it useful, consider to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. More content is coming and stay tuned.